Good morning. Welcome to our special meeting of Municipal Council agenda for Tuesday, May 14th, 2024. I'd like to call this meeting to order at this time, and welcome to our May 14th special meeting of Municipal Council. Are there any declarations of interest from members of council? Seeing none, I'm sorry, Brian, I didn't see you. Thank you.
No problem. No problem. Thank you, Madam Mayor. And my conflict is as it pertains to item E1 on the agenda today. So I own a company that holds a property that is currently listed as heritage. And so after consultation with the Integrity Commissioner, it was determined that because my interest is different in kind from general community interest, that I should be declaring a conflict. I did also want to note that further to this declaration does not affect my discussions surrounding the Sharon Heritage Conservation District, and I will continue to be a part of those specific discussions. So thank you, Madam Mayor.
Thank you very much. I will move to our land acknowledgement. The town of East Gwillimbury recognizes and acknowledges the lands originally used and occupied by the First Peoples of the Williams Treaty First Nations and other Indigenous peoples. And on behalf of Council, I thank them for sharing this land. We also acknowledge the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation as East Gwillimbury's closest First Nation community and recognize the unique relationship the Chippewas have with the lands and the waters of this territory. They are the water protectors and the environmental stewards of these lands, and we join them in these responsibilities. Item D is deputations, and we have no deputations today. Item E is workshop, and I will turn this over to Manager Beijing at this point.
Thank you. Through you, Madam Mayor. I'm happy to introduce our consultant that is working with us to develop a comprehensive heritage strategy. Sean Goodeve is actually native to East Gwillimbury. Spent some time growing up here. He brings a background in municipal planning and economic development, and as well as a heritage focus that is going to help us hopefully arrive at a comprehensive approach that aligns with our official plan in terms of how we will manage our heritage resources going forward and how we will hopefully expand our efforts to engage the community through education and interpretation. So I'll let Sean start the introduction, and I may jump in from time to time through the presentation. Thanks.
Welcome. Good to have you with us today.
Thank you very much, Madam Mayor, and the rest of the council. It's a pleasure to be here today, and thank you for the introduction there, Margot. Yeah, as Margot indicated, I grew up in East Gwillimbury, and so it's I'm back here quite often, and it is actually really been quite fascinating coming back and touring around the community. Victoria and Jack were kind enough to give me a tour of the various heritage properties, within the municipality, and a lot has changed since I grew up here, of course, and as we know, and so we have different types of pressures now in the community as we're experiencing that type of growth. As Margot indicated, I've been working in economic development and urban planning for about 25 years. And grad school was at York University, where I studied environmental studies and planning. And I've been fortunate to work for 3 different municipalities in the role of either the director of planning or economic development. And both of those experiences were in Alberta and BC. And I currently reside in Kimberley, BC, which is in the southeastern portion of the province. So a little bit of background on myself, and it's wonderful to be here. So Andrew, if you don't mind, we could advance the slides. Thank you. That's great. So in terms of our work today and the overall kind of general work with this project, we're very much looking to provide council with an overview in terms of where we're at today in terms of the various legislation, but also in terms of the new legislation that's kind of been introduced. That's kind of obviously creating a bit of urgency in terms of how the municipality is going to be addressing heritage properties overall. We're going to look at the various tools and resources available to the municipality itself, And then we're going to talk about and provide a bit of an overview in terms of our initial findings in terms of the stakeholder engagement. Those are being direct interviews and also some research that we've been conducting and from the desktop in terms of what other municipalities are doing. So we'll cover off on all of that. And then as we conclude, we'll look at the various next steps. So this is very much in terms of ensuring that Mayor and Council are up to speed and certainly senior administration in terms of where we're at and in the direction that we can be moving in the future. And I think next I'd like to invite Margot to kind of just speak to the next slide. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you. Through you, Madam Mayor. In terms of project context, I did want to note, as Councillor Johns referred to, there's a Heritage Conservation District study being undertaken at the same time, and that will complement this work, certainly. A lot of the focus of our efforts right now are in responding to emerging legislation that has established some rapidly approaching deadlines for dealing with heritage-built form specifically. So we recognize that is certainly the focus. And there have been some conversations throughout this process to talk about other aspects of heritage, whether it be natural heritage or cultural heritage. And those can certainly form part of a wider conversation, but in the context of planning, we're very much focused on the built form for today's conversation, and recognize that the nature of that built form is very much skewed towards colonial or settler heritage. It doesn't necessarily recognize the full breadth of this community's heritage, but that being said, is still worthy of consideration and protection, and in the context of this conversation for today. But just didn't want to lose sight of the fact that there are also broader elements that hopefully will form part of a future approach to heritage conservation and education.
That's great. Thank you, Margot. Something I neglected to mention in my introduction is that I'm also Métis, and very proud of that fact. And multiple members of my family are part of the Métis Nation of Ontario. So, obviously, in terms of the Indigenous context within the area, that too is very important to me. And certainly, we don't want to disregard that by any means. And certainly, but again, this project is really focusing specifically around the built heritage within the community itself. If we could have the next slide, please, Andrew. Thank you. So just in terms of a bit of a timeline, again, in terms of the context for us today, we want to kind of just make sure that everyone is aware in terms of, where we're at and where we are moving to in the future here. In terms of this timeline you see on the screen in terms of the presentation, there was a heritage register prior to 2019. However, between 2019 and 2021, ASI was commissioned to conduct a review of the town's heritage register. So the heritage register is a tool for municipalities where they collect and maintain information in terms of all the different properties, the heritage properties within the municipality. And ASI is obviously kind of the largest archaeological and heritage firm within Ontario, and they've worked across the province. And so they conducted this review, and the purpose of the review was to really kind of take a look at the various listed properties that were on the register and ideally try to trim that back a bit and validate some of the findings within the register itself, and then provide recommendations. And we're going to review that, the overall heritage register and that work specifically a little further along in the presentation. But as you may know, back in the fall, last fall of 2023, that list, the total list of the heritage within the heritage register, was consolidated even further. So there was a reduction in the total number of properties on the list, and so it was reduced down to 378. And we have it in bold here in terms of the designated properties. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit in terms of what it means to be listed and versus designated. But the designated properties, you had 12 as of last week, and of course, with Gary's property, it was just added to the register as designated properties, and that was just at the last council meeting just last week. So you currently have 13 designated properties. And big picture in terms of why we're here today is foremost around Bill 23, and that's the province's bill. This is the More Homes Faster Act, as some people might know it that way. And Bill 23 has a specific section, I believe it's section 6, and it speaks specifically in terms of a municipality's heritage register. And the very kind of abbreviated version of it is that there's a deadline approaching in terms of January 1st, 2025, and properties that are either designated, or if they're not designated on that list, then the list itself, they'll be delisted. So there's kind of a bit of a looming deadline here for all municipalities across the province to identify various properties, those heritage properties within their municipality, and determine whether or not they want to designate them or not. We're going to talk more specifics in terms of that list, but this is the general kind of overview of the timeline itself. Now I'd like to get into the More Homes Built Faster Act itself. Thank you very much, Andrew. So these are the changes, and specifically, as I mentioned before, so Schedule 6 of the bill really looks at the implications for municipalities around heritage properties. So if a property was already on the list prior to January 1st, 2023, then council must, and this is our part of our action here, before January 1st, 2025, either issue a notice of intention to designate the property or remove the property from the register. Now, if the heritage property was listed on January 1st, 2023, then within 2 years of the listing date, either council issues a notice of intention to designate the property, or again, remove it from the register itself. And the third point here is quite important. If a non-designated property is removed from the register because it's not being designated before the deadline, it cannot be relisted for 5 years, so a 5-year period. So that takes us out to 2030. So again, there's a sense of urgency and importance here. Thank you, Andrew. In terms of the Ontario Heritage Act, and I'll refer to that going forward as the OHA, in terms of how a property is and the rationale around designation, it's not simply just in terms of, well, that's an old building, that probably should be registered. There's a whole list of criteria that takes place, and we've listed that here, but quite simply, there's about 3 components in terms of that rationale for designation. And the first one is around the design value or the physical value of the property. And it speaks to these other elements in terms of that it's representative of a certain particular architectural style, or there's an expression of it, or it's some materials, or that it displays a high degree of craftsmanship or artistic merit, or it demonstrates a high degree of technical or scientific achievement. In terms of the next element, next slide please, Andrew. Thank you. The next component is around the historical value or the associated value. And this speaks more in terms of the associations that property would have in terms of a person or an activity or an organization or institution. And these are all that would be significant to the community and the history within the community itself. Further, that property would have a potential to yield or yields information that contributes to the overall community and the culture and our understanding of our past. And thirdly, of course, it would look to demonstrate or reflect the work or ideas of an architect or an artist or a builder or a designer, who again would be significant to the community. And in terms of the third point, that the property would have contextual value. And this speaks more in terms of the defining kind of elements and supporting character of an area, that the property itself would be physically, functionally, or visually, historically linked to its surroundings. Or, as the third point, would be a landmark, as it's noted within Ontario Regulation 906. Again, that regulation is actually quite important to us when we think about heritage properties overall, and so we kind of want to flag that for us as we go forward, because it does speak. That regulation speaks more broadly in terms of how we come to identify and determine what is a heritage property itself. So as we move forward and we look at the various tools and resources available to a municipality, again, the purpose here is really to make sure that we're all on the same page and we understand the same information that is available to us. So some of this may be new, but likely most of it is obviously within your purview. But let's just make sure we cover off on it, and we'll go into each of these a little bit more in detail. So the first part is around the property standards bylaw. And there is a component within the property standards bylaw we'll look at, and that does speak specifically to heritage properties. As council is well aware, there is a heritage advisory committee that is within place in the municipality. We know that there's the Heritage Register, and we know that that was created in 2019, and then it was updated again, consolidated in 2023. The Part 4 and Part 5, that refers to the OHA, the Ontario Heritage Act, and Part 4 speaks specifically around the properties themselves, and Part 5 is around the heritage conservation districts. And at this point, one can just flag, of course, within your official plan, it identifies the various zones or heritage districts, recommendations within the municipality. And of course, we're currently in the process in terms of the designation around the Sharon area as a heritage district. In terms of property designation, again, this kind of speaks back to, the Act itself in terms of, looking at the heritage significance and the attributes of the property, and certainly looking the municipality's functions around preserving that property, and certainly if there's any, requests in terms of demolition or alteration to that property, of course, that would come before council. First, it would come obviously to the staff, then it'd be referred to the Heritage Advisory Committee, and then, of course, as you well know and have experienced, it would come to council itself. The last point here, I think, is really quite important, and that is the Ontario Guide to Heritage Property Tax Relief. I'm going to talk about some of the tools further in the presentation, but there's actually a program already in place that looks at the ability for municipalities to provide various types of incentives in regards to preserving and maintaining heritage properties. So again, we'll talk about that a little bit further on. But you can see there's a whole suite of various tools and resources that are available to you. Thank you, Andrew. In regards to the property standards bylaw, much like in any municipality, and as I indicated, I've been the director of planning, and I've had bylaw enforcement under my portfolio in the past, and it's always something of a challenge in terms of resource and capacity for any municipality, and oftentimes it tends to be kind of complaint driven, and so I know I've found that quite challenging in the past in terms of just enforcing the bylaws and having the appropriate staff and to be able to kind of do our best work around that. But just to be clear, that we do have the property standards bylaw, and it does speak specifically around heritage property, and so it does again look at alterations or demolition, and the requirements for permits and processing, and it also speaks more broadly in terms of the responsibilities of the homeowner and the property owner to maintain and preserve and protect the heritage attributes, again, the character, the visual integrity, and structural integrity of the heritage property. So that's a little more detail in terms of that specific tool that we have available to us. Next, I'd like to talk about the Heritage Advisory Committee itself. So the committee has been established, obviously, by the municipality, and the intent here is that it would provide advice and assistance to town council on heritage matters and to address the requirements under the Ontario Heritage Act. So the council, the Heritage Committee, that is, would then review and when there's submissions in terms of a type of alteration or demolition, and certainly even more broadly looking at the Heritage Register in terms of some of the recommendations within it. Presently, your staff liaison on the Heritage Advisory Committee is Victoria Moore, of course, and the committee itself meets on a monthly basis. And so the purpose is really to make those recommendations and look towards designation. So this is an important piece in terms of our overall process as we look forward to this looming deadline in terms of how do we which properties we designate. So it's very much within the purview of our advisory committee, and we have members of the advisory committee here today as well. And I should mention too, not just in terms of the properties, but certainly around the heritage districts as well would also fall in the purview of the HAC. And if I start throwing around too many acronyms, please correct me on that. So in terms of the Heritage Register itself, and again, this is the review that was taking place and then the consolidation that took place in 2023. It was very much around looking at, making the register itself more manageable to allow for, a greater kind of appreciation of the properties that remain in the register as being truly significant to the town and to its history. I'd like to note here that I think every municipality really tends to kind of grapple in terms of their heritage register. There's a lot of municipalities that have multiples more properties within their register, and so each municipality has a very kind of broad list, and then there's the listed properties, if you will, as in non-designated, and then certainly on the designated side as well. And we really want to kind of point out some of the recommendations that came out of that review that took place in 2021 by ASI, and that was the firm who's specialized, obviously, in archaeological and heritage culture. So one of the recommendations was that it identified 23 properties that should be prioritized for further study for potential designation under Part 4, so that's the properties themselves, of the Ontario Heritage Act. And we should note that none of those properties currently are designated. In addition, it aligns with the town's official plan, and I believe it's Section 6 of your official plan that speaks specifically around heritage properties. And so that's quite a robust component to your official plan, and it speaks to the celebration and maintenance of your heritage and your the overall culture. Within the register itself, there was rather extensive community engagement, both with the advisory committee. There was sessions that took place with council. Some of you may recall that. And then there was an open house that took place. There was one that was in person. It was also virtual. The last point here is quite interesting, is that the majority of the properties on the Heritage Register date to the mid to late 19th century, with some properties dating to the early and mid 20th century. And it probably comes as no surprise that as you travel around the community, you would see it's quite visually striking, right? Like you can actually identify this is in a particular time frame, in a certain era for many of these properties, and that aligns back to the register itself. And just to kind of go over in terms of where these properties are located. And I think you may find this quite interesting. So the Brown Hill community area, there's 7 that are listed. Again, when I say listed, that means it's non-designated. And within Holland Landing, there's 27. And now we have 1 designated, again, as of last week. Within the Holt community area, there's 3 that are listed. Within Mount Albert community area, there's 91 listed, and only 2 are designated within Mount Albert. In Queensville, there's 45 listed, and there's only 1 designated there. In River Drive Park community area, there's 1 designated. I believe that's the Soldiers Bay military depot area. In the rural context, there's 157 listed and 6 designated. And within Sharon community area, there's 35 listed and only 2 are designated. So it's quite interesting, when we look at the composition here, obviously there's certain community areas that have a rather high degree in terms of those heritage properties that are listed. But it's really been quite interesting in terms of this project when we think about the geographical grouping of heritage properties. I think we can, and I've spoken with some of you about this through our engagement, but, really looking at it in the context of, rural versus urban. And within each of those, there's different types of, pressures and in terms of, those properties. But it's interesting to kind of think about it in the context of, rural versus urban. And we'll speak a bit more of that as we kind of move along. In terms of the designated properties, we thought it'd be helpful just to name the property itself and then also the address to, again, provide further context. As you may be aware, within the Heritage Register, there are maps within the Heritage Register that identify where each of the properties are. So if you wanted as a follow-up to look at those at a later date, you could. But this may help in terms of just kind of understanding the name of the property, So, the William James Sloan House, for example, in Holland Landing. Again, in Holland, the Soldier Bay Military Depot in River Drive Park, the Sharon Burying Ground, the John and Jessie Doan House. So, this is something, I think how a lot of us would be thinking about those properties rather versus the address itself. And certainly in the rural area, we can, just identify these various designated properties here. And it's interesting to note as well, we've got the Kelly Swing Bridge, and then obviously there's other homes there as well, like the Millard House, the Elmer House, and the Harrison Holborn home as well. So again, just for context in terms of where we're, oh, thank you. Okay, we're zipping along. I apologize, I was looking at my screen here, and I'll be keep a closer eye on that other one up there. So if we could, Andrew, go to the slide that has the timeline on it. And there's like a little graphic there on the bottom that says the historical narrative. Yes, thank you. That's perfect. So this is from the obviously a bit of a summary in terms of the Heritage Register itself, and again looking at the overall kind of methodology that was taking place within the Heritage Register that was conducted by ASI, the firm ASI, when they did the work on the review of the Heritage Register, and it's It's quite a complex approach and complex methodology. And obviously, as I indicated earlier, they are the largest firm in Ontario, and they've been in operation and working with municipalities across the province since the 80s. So very robust. And again, if you look at the Heritage Register review and the individuals that conducted it, you'll see their credentials and the experience that they kind of brought to bear on that project. And so they applied a kind of a standardized approach, but at the same time, it was also customized specifically for East Gwillimbury. But in the broader context, they looked at the various historical themes. So this is pre-colonial, then settlement, then village and hamlet development. And then it's quite interesting, of course, then you look at agriculture, transportation, and industry, civic, and cultural growth. So those are kind of like the larger kind of categories that kind of initiates in terms of when we're looking overall at the categorization of heritage properties, and certainly leading to the determination whether or not they would be on the list or even designated. In terms of the historical narrative, as they put it, this is something of a timeline. You can see that in the graph at the bottom of as I just double check this slide here. So we're looking at pre-colonial habitation. So this dates back to 11,500 years ago, and it moves forward up into 1793. And then the next time frame is looking at Yonge Street and the surveying lands, and that was taking place between 1790 and 1800. And then moving on would be the Holland River and early settlement period, which is 1800 to 1820. And the villages of East Gwillimbury, which is 1820 and 1913. Concurrent in that same time frame from 1800 to 1850 is also the religious center. And then the final category here would be what brings us very much to present day. So it's looking at from 1913 to 2014. So again, these are kind of the components in terms of how they would reach the categorization through the assessment of the properties themselves. And again, there's a very detailed methodology section within the ASI report if you'd like to look at that further. So I'd like to talk a bit in terms of some of these the recommendations that were within the report itself and the review, I should say. And format, it's like updating some of the information of the properties and identifying those that would not be recommended from removal for the heritage register from the Heritage Register. And so this is an important kind of component. Another one, as we mentioned earlier, there's currently underway in terms of the Heritage District. So again, that relates to Part 5 of the Ontario Heritage Act. But one of the recommendations within the review was that the village of Mount Albert should be prioritized as a Heritage Conservation District under Part 4, as I indicated, and that the properties within Mount Albert should remain on the Heritage Register until that study is complete. And of course, that has not transpired at this time in terms of this particular recommendation. Similarly, in terms of the 23 properties that I highlighted earlier that should be prioritized for further study and potential designation under Part 4, that also has not transpired. And there's another component here in terms of updating and removing properties with incorrect addresses and other data. That related mostly in terms of inconsistencies in terms of the municipality's roll number, and sometimes the addresses were incorrect. Not grossly incorrect, but it would be literally the address right next door. So just some inconsistencies there that they had flagged and identified that should be recommended in terms of updating the overall register itself. Great. Next, I'd like to go into the thank you, Andrew. The engagement, and so what we've been doing preceding this council workshop is having various conversations with members of the senior administration within the town, and also with the various elected officials, mayor and council, and also some external stakeholders as well. And so what we're sharing today is just in terms of some of the statements that we heard from the early kind of purview. And this will help to kind of inform as we move forward overall in terms of the development of the strategy. But we want to kind of share this and just make sure that every member of council is aware of this, because of course this is a consolidation of those findings. So in a broad context, there's a very much wide understanding from all of the interviewees that there's a very strong heritage across the municipality, and specifically around those village cores that we identified earlier. In terms of the heritage properties, this goes back to my comment earlier, that there's a rural versus urban, and that the rural versus urban is very much kind of speaks in terms of the type of pressures and also how we engage with those heritage properties. Sometimes in a rural context, you may not see the property itself. It's so far, be so far set back from the road, of course, because that was the agricultural style at the time. So it's very interesting to kind of think of it in those kind of buckets, if you will, in terms of that rural versus urban, because they're different types of property owner groups. And in terms of the sense around the ownership, there is definitely a strong sense that there's two kind of main constituents, if you will, in terms of those property owners. There are the private property owners. These are individuals who may have lived in a heritage property for some time, or they've recently purchased a heritage property. And then there's the other component, which would be the development community, who would be purchasing land for future development. And so there's a perception in terms of the people that we've spoken with that there's these two kind of big stakeholder groups. And we find that because each of those then obviously have different capacity to preserve and maintain the property itself and resources as well. And so it's a different, each of those are perceived to be treated differently in some sense. Certainly in terms of the interviewees, that there is a feeling that those rural properties were less threatened, and that was a common phrase that came up through the interviews. And what threatened meant was in terms of the maintenance and preservation of that property, and certainly around the concept of demolition and the state of that property itself, and that they were less threatened than the urban properties. And I think in large part, based on our conversations, that related to something of an out of sight, out of mind kind of perception versus driving down, the Leslie Street and seeing that property, and it's very much front of mind for you. And of course, for many of us that live here and grew up in the community, you have a relationship with it, right? You may have known somebody who lived in that house, and so there's a different way of thinking about it. And certainly, as the councillor had indicated in terms of his disclosure earlier, and he actually obviously owns a property as well. So we all have different relationships. So I think it's a little bit different in that urban versus rural context. As we move through the next stage, thank you, in terms of the current situation. Again, these are responses in terms of our engagement. That the council itself and the Town of East Gwillimbury Council is very much in support of heritage preservation and conservation, and as I indicated earlier, that very much aligns back to your official plan. But that there's also a need for a heritage strategy to help us kind of guide the municipality's policies and programs going forward. And there was a broad sentiment within those that were interviewed is that there's been something of an ad hoc approach in terms of the decision making around heritage properties, and I would sense that maybe members of council would resonate. Where certainly for the advisory committee and certainly for members of council and even staff, there's a reactive kind of component to things where it's like, oh, there's a property owners who's making an application either for perhaps demolition or alteration, and so there's always this kind of sense of like, oh my gosh, we're trying to deal with this, and what are the tools available? And that's very much around what we're doing here with this project, is that ensuring that members of council and administration have the tools and understand how to kind of move forward with that. There's also was a broad kind of sense here in terms of that the overall development community, that they were perceived to be very much generally supportive of heritage preservation, and that there's a willingness. But at the same time, there was a requirement for clarity and a common kind of fair approach in terms of how the municipality treats various heritage properties. So as we move into the role of the town, thank you. Comments surrounded around that the town itself should be an advocate for heritage conservation and preservation, that they should be taking that role. Again, these are the responses, right? And so we want to kind of discuss these in further detail with you today. But again, these are the responses that we've been hearing. And overall, as I mentioned, there needs to be a consistent and fair approach to all stakeholders. So again, both looking at all those different ownership groups versus and areas as well in terms of urban and rural. And this point here around the property standards bylaw, and again, as we mentioned, doing our best to enforce the property standards bylaw, with the resources at hand that we have currently. And so, it's really important for us to just be cognizant of that bylaw and doing, everything we can to be able to kind of respond in a timely manner. But again, we have some resource limitations in that regard. But I think through our exercise with this work and this strategy, I think that's going to actually kind of help those types of the property standards enforcement, and we'll kind of talk around how we're going to propose to do that. And further, that the town should be promoting the role and the work of the Heritage Advisory Committee. We identified that there's members of the community that aren't actually fully aware that there is a Heritage Advisory Committee composed of very dedicated volunteers who are very passionate and committed to the efforts around heritage preservation and conservation. And furthermore, in terms of and this is probably one of the most important components here, is just around the education and awareness, for the broader community overall, as it relates to heritage within our community, and specifically around those heritage property owners. And we've listed a few things here in terms of some of the functions, but in broad strokes, there's a lot of misconceptions out there in terms of the broader community, but certainly around heritage property owners, that there's again these misconceptions kind of relate to like what they can and can't do, and how the municipality may dictate what the property owners can do, and so there's a lot of misconception around that, and so this component is going to be really important for us going forward around that communication and the overall broader kind of awareness around specifically around heritage properties and what that means and what are the benefits and the responsibility of being an owner of a heritage property. We had a couple of the interviewees use the term that the owners of heritage properties are very much caretakers. And I thought that was a very interesting way to phrase it. And I thought it captured it quite eloquently in terms of, the responsibility in terms of those heritage properties. But they're caretakers of our past and our culture. And I thought that was quite interesting. And again, specifically looking at, how we can, inform and help assist these various property owners, to celebrate and to preserve and to maintain. So in terms of the designation process, the next slide, please, Andrew. Thank you. Respondents were very conscious of this, and it's a bit of quite a challenging question, in terms of like, well, how many properties do you think, should be designated? What's achievable? What's manageable? And that question was posed in the absence of, financial implication, staff resources, et cetera. So it's quite challenging, but in a general sense, the respondents said, that it was probably likely that we could look at, designating anywhere from 5 to 10 additional heritage properties. And so just to circle back, we currently have 13 designated right now within the municipality. There was a very broad consensus that the heritage property owners very much should be engaged, and they should be contacted, and to determine their level of interest, whether or not they are interested in having a property designated. Again, this kind of speaks a little bit further in terms of our overall strategy. And then there was also consensus around that if the property is to be determined to be of high priority for the municipality, and that it is to be designated, that the town should support the property owner. And again, there was some discussions around what that support would look like. In large part, it was about education and awareness. There was a very broad identification in terms of that was a major hurdle, a major challenge. And then there's some other discussion in terms of what that type of support would look like coming from the town itself. And that leads me into financial incentives. And this is where the respondents kind of spoke to types of support that they feel that the town should be engaging in. And so there was a very broad kind of consensus that, again, looking back to this notion of, heritage properties are a community asset, and that the town should be supportive of that, and certainly around the designated properties. There was a lot of discussion around property tax rebates to assist the property owners themselves. And then should be other types of financial supports through other types of grants or types of programs. That would include like facade programs, for example. And that there's again, around that kind of facade program, that there's a consideration around that should be funded through a type of grant program itself. Okay, so I'd like to kind of just talk about next steps, and then we can kind of open it up, if it's okay, Madam Mayor, to a broader discussion. In terms of our moving forward and our approach here, we're going to be conducting surveys. So we'll have a resident and a business survey that we'll be launching. We want to make sure we're doing that when there isn't concurrent engagement with the community. So we're going to be developing those surveys and survey tools, and we'll be launching it in the coming weeks. And again, asking very kind of pointed questions, both to residents and businesses. That's quite important, of course. We've got a lot of heritage properties within commercial areas, if you will. We're going to be continuing our work in terms of speaking with and doing research with other municipalities across the province. We've already interviewed several communities thus far that have been also dealing with this matter in terms of the designation and their process. And I really kind of want to point out here too, in terms of the strategy itself, we really want to be thinking about how do we implement? What do we do next? So after our discussion today, we can kind of look at some of these other municipalities in terms of what they have and haven't done, and look at those kind of best practices and see what's applicable for us that we can customize for East Gwillimbury. Further that, after we complete the surveys and we conduct the best practice review, if you will, or the research with the other municipalities, we'll come back for a second round of interviews with mayor and council and have those discussions on those findings, and we'll discuss further in terms of some of those explorations to help kind of guide us towards our overall strategy development, which of course will be the report writing itself, and then we'll conclude with another council presentation, and we're targeting the end of June for that. So it's a little bit of a tight time frame, but as I indicated at the outset, we're looking at January 1st, 2025 as our deadline. So we need to be moving at a pace that is appropriate, and also ensuring that we're soliciting as much input as we possibly can as we move forward. So that concludes the presentation component, and we'd just like to open it up to discussions. And perhaps before I do, Madam Mayor, I can just defer to Margot in case there's any type of follow-up that you'd like to add.
Thank you, and through you, Madam Mayor, I think this was a really good overview of sort of where we are in terms of a lot of foundational work has been completed, and really the conversations going forward are about where the council and residents feel we should be focusing our efforts, and what are the most important things we need to achieve, and then what is the plan going forward in terms of having a more of a robust ongoing program around education, interpretation, those types of things. So this is not just about a registry, but also our approach to heritage conservation going forward.
Thank you. Do we have questions from members of council? Councillor Foster, go ahead, please.
Thanks, Madam Mayor. I guess I'll start. I think the first thing that I would like to see done, and I'm not trying to pile work on Mr. Marshall and his staff, but when we're talking about this Ontario Guide to Heritage Property and tax relief, is there a chance that we can get some information or a report of how that would be kind of East Gwillimbury-ized? How the different ideas in that report or guideline would affect us in East Gwillimbury, and the numbers that would go along with it. And I mean, if we need a resolution to do something of that kind, I'd certainly support that, but I'd like to hear the thoughts of some of my colleagues here.
Thank you. Thoughts of the colleagues? Councillor Crothers, go ahead, please.
Thank you. First of all, I just want to say thank you for the presentation. It's a really good overview, and it makes me feel like we're working towards a plan, and it's good to have a plan policy in place rather than just doing these one-offs that we've been doing. So I'm pleased with that. The tax relief is interesting, because I do feel if we're asking residents to do something specific for the greater good, preserving heritage in this case, then we shouldn't put the financial burden on them. But at the same time, the tax relief is actually a shift of the tax burden to someone else. So we need to determine who we are shifting that tax to. If we're if we're doing tax relief for someone who owns a heritage home, who's backfilling that, right? So could we have a separate fund where anytime someone is penalized for a heritage violation, the money goes in there, or developers who want to demolish something to make way for development, so that like pays for like, and that we're not asking the average homeowner to be making up for the taxes that we're exempting others from. So that's my one comment to Councillor Foster's question about that. I also wanted to, right at the beginning, I just want to acknowledge that I appreciate that it was built in to the presentation about how this presentation is focusing on the built heritage, but we do have significant other heritage, Indigenous, cultural heritage, natural heritage, and I really want to use this as a opportunity to do something with the rest of that heritage. I think if we don't start a process with this in front of us, that we would never get around to it. And we have so much heritage as far as not just Indigenous heritage, but everything from the hedgerows and the 100-year-old trees, and even the anchor in Anchor Park that don't fall into this category. So while this presentation isn't about all those other things exist, and we really need an inventory of them and decide how we're going to protect them as well. And I just feel like coming out of this, if we don't do something about it, then it will never come up again. So I'd like to listen to my colleagues if we want to put a resolution on the table to look at a presentation from staff on the rest of our heritage that is not part of this presentation. So I'm going to leave that with everyone else to think about. Thank you.
Ms. Beijing, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I just wanted to offer some context with respect to the tax incentive structure. And I think it presumes that heritage is a community benefit, and so that having these assets in our community benefits everyone, and that's sort of the justification for being able to offer those people who are tasked with the upkeep and maintenance and whatever financial implications that might have with a bit of a break to incent. And it's kind of like if you look at the incentives, whether they be through grants or through tax abatement, that's sort of the proactive tool that we have to ensure preservation and conservation, whereas at the opposite end of the spectrum, where the bylaw is much more reactive and is also resource intensive. So I think I agree it would be valuable to better understand the implications, just recognizing that we're likely talking about somewhere in the order of magnitude of 30 to 40 maximum residents that would potentially benefit from this. So my suggestion is just, I think it's important to consider this in terms of what council sees as the benefit to the community as a whole by being able to preserve and have an interpretation around these assets. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Crone, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and thank you to our presenter, Mr. Goody. We appreciate it. It was very, very informative, and not wanting to ratchet up your anxiety any, but January 1st isn't really the deadline. It's December 17th. That's our last council meeting of the year, so we need to have this wrapped up before then. Just so that I'm clear, through you, Madam Mayor, to our presenter, the legislation that the province has, it's, just so I understand, it's either your designated heritage or you're not. We're basically abolishing the heritage list. Is that, have I got that clear?
Yes, sorry, through you, Madam Mayor. Yes, that's correct. So the properties would be delisted for the time frame that then they could not be back on the register for a period of 5 years. And that's how the Bill 23 currently reads, and that'd be Schedule 6 of the bill.
Okay, thank you, through you, Madam Mayor. Thank you for that. I think we've got quite a chore ahead of us, 378 properties that are listed. So I know you're working on the plans to get to them. I think there's probably a divide and conquer approach you can take, because there will be some of them that are are owned by individuals, and there will be some that are owned by developers, and maybe the approach is different to both. Maybe, I don't know, just a thought. As well, through you, Madam Mayor, I think, the comment was made about properties that are in the rural areas that maybe are defended a little better. I think part of that has to do also with the fact that they're in the green belt, and so that property won't be, it's protected from development as well. So there's probably a greater likelihood of preserving them. From my own personal standpoint, I think there is a community benefit to having heritage designated properties in your community. I've seen other towns do it, and I think they do. I think we can all think of examples where it's done really well, and I think it adds to the community vibe, and it's nice, and I think it adds value, and so I have no issues with supporting them through the tax base. I think Councillor Carruthers makes an interesting point about if we can find a way of funding it other than the tax base, effectively subsidizing it. I think practically it might be hard to do that if you have an unlimited supply of penalties that we're levied against others. There's examples elsewhere in the community where people are paying for things that they don't necessarily, you pay into the school taxes, school board taxes, but you may not have children. So there are examples of that where we don't necessarily have a direct line of sight to that. So I don't have an issue with that. I think we should support it in some financial means. However we decide and land on it, I'm happy with that. But boy, we've got 7 months. We've got a lot of work to do. So thank you for this, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot more discussion on it. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Thank you. Councillor Roy Clemente, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Through you, I guess there's a lot of material for us to consider today, and I appreciate you distilling some of that for us. I guess I'll keep my comments, I'll scope my comments. For me, I focused on the fact that the last work that was done identified 23 properties identified for potential designation, and your presentation is telling us today that at best we can potentially designate 10. And so that will leave us 13 to 18 properties that are not going to necessarily have any benefit of protection that were already identified as being candidates for designation. So for me, it's about addressing that immediate concern that those properties are most at risk. And so I might like to hear from maybe our Heritage Advisory Committee or from staff what's on that list of, how do we prioritize those from those 23? How do we pick the ones that are most at risk, firstly? And secondly, of the 13 that are designated right now, I might argue that some of them are already not even paying property taxes. I don't believe the cemeteries are paying taxes, for example. So, perhaps to Councillor Foster's point, we could get an understanding from finance staff of what that materiality would look like. If we offer a tax rebate of a range, let's say it's 30 to 40, because that seems to be where other municipalities land. What does that look like for those 13 designated properties, and what does that look like for the other 23, let's say? So from that perspective, if we decide to go down that road, I'm hoping we can do that quicker, so that when you go out to speak to those property owners to see if they're interested in being designated, that you can say with some confidence, Council has committed to a tax relief program that's to be identified, and we can figure that out after January 1. But let's see if we can, if maybe of those 23 properties, there are a couple of properties that say, yeah, I'd like to be designated. We can add those pretty quickly and expand that 5 to 10, maybe even to a few more. With respect to Councillor Carruthers' concerns about our natural heritage and our cultural heritage, I know that we did have, I want to say it's 2011, we had a cultural mapping exercise that was done that identified some of those properties, some of those aspects and locations and things. There was a strategy, I think, that was developed, but I'm pretty sure that whole project was shelved, and it might be worthy of revisiting some of that after we've dealt with this. And I agree, we don't necessarily want to lose track of it, but there is the desire. I think we talked in the past about designating the trees on Catering Road, for example, as a natural heritage, worthy of natural heritage and cultural designation because of the impact, the visual impact that it has. But again, the anchor is also important to us. So I think from that perspective, we can perhaps capture that as part of a work plan for 2025, 2026. Let's put that, I don't think we can put resolutions on the table here because we're in a workshop. But I think for me, it's about scoping that 23 properties that were identified and how do we collect as many of those as quickly as possible to protect them. Thank you.
Madam Mayor, I'm sorry, Margaret, I didn't see your hand.
Sorry, maybe I'll take a stab at starting, and you can sort of jump in. But I just wanted to clarify that that number, the 5 to 10, is not a hard and fast number. That reflects the perception. With resources, dedicated to this, that number could increase, certainly. We know of other municipalities that have brought on full-time staff just to deal with this specific issue. That being said, the process is a lot lengthier and more cumbersome if there's opposition. So obviously, if there is an interest on the part of the property owner, then that becomes a much simpler path. But I think that's part of the ongoing conversation is what is the appetite to pursue designation if there is resistance, because that is a resource-intensive process itself as well. And so I think that's an important thing to think about. And I think what we can do, to your point, is if we have staff can reach out to the folks that are on that list of 23 once we have an understanding of potential incentives available, and gauge the appetite, and that'll give us better information of are there 5 people coming forward, are they all interested, that type of thing. So I think that will be helpful in narrowing down the list.
Thank you. Councillor, go ahead.
Thank you very much through you, Madam Mayor. This is a very much needed workshop that we're having because our term, this council, we have been dealing with on an ad hoc basis multiple instances of heritage homes coming before us as council. And I can say that even having practiced as a professional art appraiser for 2 decades and being very familiar with criteria of value and history and all the components that go into making appraisals and valuations of worth, and there's a whole conversation we could have about value and worth and how to define that. But I want to specifically ask you about the disproportionate number of homes that have been identified in Mount Albert, specifically 91 out of the 378. And if there are any reasons why there is that disproportionately high number, and if this should be taken into consideration when we're identifying those potentially 10 homes that can be designated before December 17th, 2024. So that's the first question about the disproportionate designation of homes in Mount Albert. If those should be in any way, and I'm sure we can discuss this in a more fulsome way later today, but if those should be considered priorities, if we don't have representation on the official list, as well as you referenced the Mount Albert Heritage District, which was not completed or formalized in any way. And we are currently looking forward to the revitalization project of the downtown of Mount Albert, hopefully starting later in 2024. So what implications are there if we want to potentially designate parts of Mount Albert as a downtown heritage district, and this deadline that we are working towards?
Great. Madam Mayor, through you. Yeah, and I'd like to just reiterate the comment that Margot made in terms of the respondent sense, in terms of the 5 to 10. Again, that was the, just a current situation in terms of how response felt what might be achievable, but certainly it was in the absence of resourcing, staff capacity, et cetera. So again, we're kind of looking at that as a number. I would say though, through our research and through conversations with other municipalities that are grappling with this, they're finding that is likely an achievable amount, but it's also important to keep in consideration that so many and many municipalities across the province are also dealing with this. So in terms of overall capacity of heritage planners and specialists in this area to assist, municipalities are finding other interesting, creative ways to address it. For example, one municipality is looking at, in terms of having planning technicians, and so what they've been doing is they're looking at hiring people who have a background perhaps in archaeology or in history, and so they have they have an understanding and an education around conducting that type of work and that type of research. But in terms of the policy development, then that very much requires municipal staff who are planners in terms of the development of that type of policy. So yeah, there's different tools that are available to us that we'll be looking at. And again, today is just broader kind of context in terms of the overview of the project itself, and then thinking around how do we deal with these next steps. Back to your question, and through you, Madam Mayor, if I may, to Councillor Leahy, just in regards to the properties in Mount Albert. Again, that was the application in terms of the overall methodology that was applied by the consultants, and so when they derived at the 91 properties, it was through the lens. So it was looking at the historical kind of the time frame. So we looked at kind of pre-colonial and settlement and agriculture. Then we looked at the historical framework assessments. There's various context statements. And so all of that kind of got bundled into the overall methodology, and that's how they derived at the number within Mount Albert. I think to put it very, very summarize their work, and I'm hesitant to do so, but I would think that it's just Mount Albert is very rich within those heritage properties and that type of heritage, and so I wouldn't feel very comfortable in terms of understanding exactly how they derived it, other than to say they applied the same methodology to those properties as they did across the entire community, and that's why they derived at the 91. In terms of your question, in regards to the recommendation within the report for the Heritage District, I think it probably best, if I may, Margot, if I can defer to yourself or even to Victoria in terms of the implications there as it relates to that revitalization project. But I will say, prior to deferring to Margot, that is also already emerging through our research, that the other municipalities have concurrent programs, whether it's when we're looking at heritage districts and heritage zones, that they also have other types of revitalization type of efforts ongoing. Some have, for example, business improvement associations, so they're able to kind of levy a specific tax in terms of maybe parking if it's for the commercial area. So it's not uncommon that there would be concurrent types of programs. But I think I'll just park it right there, and I'll defer to your expert on stuff.
Thank you, and through you, Madam Mayor, just I guess for context, the thinking behind how we've approached the Heritage Conservation District was to really sort of go through the first process with Sharon. It's a learning opportunity for staff, or for the community, for council, and just to understand that and see what the reception to that study is, because it's not a foregone conclusion that that the district will be established, or that the district boundaries will be exactly as proposed. So that was really just in the context of it being a new process and available resourcing. That was sort of the rationale. It's not to suggest that there isn't merit in also exploring that in Mount Albert. I think if we wanted to talk about starting the work in Mount Albert sooner, we certainly could do that, but you need to have resources in place to do that, so that we can have that conversation. As it relates to the revitalization project, the bulk of the work that's being undertaken really is in the engineering realm in terms of utilities and road alignment. So there's certainly no reason why the establishment of a Heritage Conservation District can't complement that work. It's been recognized through the outreach, especially with the business community, that there's an interest in, you know, facade improvement, in restoration, and, you know, so I don't think those two projects are in any conflict. It's just, again, it comes down to resourcing and timing, but they can certainly be complementary, I would expect.
Are there other comments, questions? Councillor Foster, go ahead, please.
Thanks, Madam Mayor. I guess kind of in response to Councillor Roy DeClemente's thought process, it should be mentioned that the Heritage Advisory Committee has decided, at some of our pushing, to have a good look at the list and try to come up with a more manageable number that we think are important to the town of East Gwillimbury. And on Thursday night, I think you're meeting with us, with the Heritage Advisory Committee this Thursday, isn't it? So I think we'll have a good chat around that at that time, but, you know, I think a good hard look at the 23 would probably be the place for us to start and go from there. So most, if not all, of the committee has already kind of been doing a little bit of that work at this time. So I want to change gears a little bit here. So after January 2025, if the government doesn't push an extension out, which I think a lot of municipalities have been looking at, I find it hard to believe that they wouldn't consider that. But with no heritage list in place, and I don't know if I'm looking for an answer right now, or I can give you something to think about for Thursday night when you meet with the group. How do we as a municipality work better with developers that now probably own a piece of property with a heritage home on it that they knew was a heritage home when they bought the property? How do we work with them to be a little bit more sympathetic with us as a municipality, and I'm sure other municipalities are going through the same thing, that we push our thought process upon them that we would love to see the heritage home built into their community, used for a commercial or retail or restaurant or whatever it might be, and have the community built around that asset, let's say. Are there any fabulous ideas that come to mind about how a municipality can kind of steer that a little bit?
Madam Mayor, through you. Thank you, Councillor Foster. Fantastic question. There's a lot of different examples. You know, something that's come up through our various conversations, obviously, you know, looking at that Markham, what they've done, and certainly looking at Unionville. Unionville probably a bit more specific example as it relates to your question, certainly kind of around that kind of notion of a commercial area. I think in large part, you know, that was the biggest thing that's kind of flagged, regardless if it's a developer or a private property owner, it's around that component of education. And, you know, I think that, you know, we can certainly look to be enhancing how we communicate more broadly with those property owners and how we can articulate the benefits of heritage properties. And again, something of an FAQ where we can actually just, you know, break down these misconceptions around it. You know, some private property owners think, oh my gosh, I can't even cut my grass, you know, or I can't fix my fence. And, you know, these are misconceptions. So, you know, I think there's an opportunity, and it's not a heavy lift, but there's an opportunity in terms of, you know, from the municipality perspective, in terms of that education. And again, in terms of the correspondence, there's, you know, many respondents felt that the developers were very much open to exploring different opportunities and potential around, you know, working with developers specifically in terms of, you know, that, you know, what to do with these various heritage properties. You know, certainly during our tour yesterday, and I'm kind of blanking on what road we went down, but, you know, there's a development and there's a heritage property that's, you know, was just kind of allocated on one of the lots, you know, kind of in the corner of that particular property. Some take that approach. There's some that have the perception that a heritage property should remain on that specific site, right? And so that would be a case in point in terms of that particular development. Others feel, and other municipalities have taken a different approach where it's a relocation of that heritage property onto a dedicated area. Again, different approach, different financial implications, and different means of communication. I think that ultimately, though, it needs to be fair and consistent, and it's probably a standardized approach, which at large part is a derivative of this work, you know, in terms of like, how do we actually, what do we do as a municipality? We can't be taking each ad hoc situation and applying a different set of protocols or standards. So I think that's very much in line with this. And I think I'll just kind of close on that, Councillor Foster, by saying, we're having more communications with different municipalities as we go forward, inclusive, tomorrow we've got a couple of interviews as well with different municipalities. So it's asking those very specific questions of how exactly did you engage with all the property owners, and how then, what was the best path forward? What was the lessons learned from your experience? And then how can we customize that and apply it back to East Gwillimbury? I hope that answers your question.
I'm not seeing any other hands up. Thank you very much. A lot to think about for sure, and we've got some time constraints along the way, I feel. So we'll move along unless there's anybody else that has a comment or questions. We really appreciate you having in front of us today, for sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam Mayor.
With that, could I have a mover and a seconder? Councillor Crothers? Oh, Councillor Foster, go ahead.
Thanks, Madam Mayor. Can I go back to the situation that I don't think we've given Mr. Marshall clear instructions on what we'd like done? In my mind anyway, I would like to see something that shows us some examples of a tax incentive structure and how it might work in EG, and to go further with Councillor Carruthers' thoughts, how does it affect the rest of EG? So I'm not sure how we want to word that, but Mr. Clerk, if you could throw something together, I would love to put a resolution on the floor to that effect.
Councillor Roy DeClemente, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Because we're in a workshop format, I don't think that we can put resolutions on the floor, but I'm sure that we can give direction to staff, and staff can sort of give us a sense of, I feel like there was two things. One was we would like some financial understanding of what a tax incentive program might look like and what the material impact might be to our operating budget, number one. And secondly, we would like some input from our committee and/or staff to prioritize those 23 properties so that we have an understanding of what comes next. I think that's really what we're looking for, but perhaps staff can give us an indication of next steps, please.
Thank you. Councillor Crothers, go ahead, please.
It's my understanding we're in special counsel, so resolutions can be put on the floor.
Maybe the clerk could.
Madam Mayor, we are in a special council meeting right now, so council certainly could make a resolution. I think traditionally council wouldn't do formal resolutions during a workshop, but it's certainly available to council.
Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Just to sort of some supplemental information, we can certainly in the interim share the list of the 23 properties, so council will have an understanding of where they are geographically located. I was also going to suggest that we could undertake a bit of an assessment of sort of order of magnitude, what are the resource implications if of pursuing designation when there's resistance, just so that council has that information available to them in terms of cost and time and staff effort, that type of thing. So that may help inform the decision making.
Thank you. Councillor Crothers, go ahead, please.
Okay, I would like to put a resolution on the floor, and I'm sorry to the deputy clerk that it's in writing, I haven't typed it out. And I'm happy to have it wordsmithed. The gist of it is that staff develop a report that outlines how we can identify and protect all other areas of East Gwillimbury heritage, including but not limited to significant pre-colonial sites, significant trees and hedgerows, the Anchor and Anchor Park, and the Catering Road trees, and report back to council in Q2 2025. I'm happy to have feedback on that.
Thank you. Feedback? Okay. I'm seeing nods across. Councillor Roy DeClemente.
I'm happy to support the resolution. I think that when staff come back to us, I think it really goes back to the cultural mapping exercise that's already been undertaken. So there has been some work done. It's just a question of revisiting that and refreshing it, I think. And you're giving it till 2025, so I don't think it's an undue burden for staff at this point. So I'm happy to support it.
Thank you.
Madam Mayor, I will need a bit of assistance capturing the full wording there. Just maybe if you could give me the conditions again, Councillor, the listed ones.
That staff develop a report that outlines how we, whoops, sorry, no, I am on.
It's
Oh,
on.
yeah. How we can identify and protect all other areas of East Gwillimbury heritage, including but not limited to significant pre-colonial sites, significant trees and hedgerows, the Anchor and Anchor Park, Catering Road trees, and report back in 2025. Sorry, it was Q2 2025.
Madam Mayor.
Councillor Leahy, go ahead, please.
A question has just come to my mind through you, Madam Mayor, with respect to the tree designations. Has the draft bylaw that has that a tremendous amount of work has gone into, and we've discussed the draft bylaw update for trees. Is this not an overlapping of the trees in terms of the bylaws that we've already organized? Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
Thank you. The tree protection bylaw protects all trees in East Gwillimbury, and this is about looking for our 100-year-old trees and identifying where they are. Excuse me. So the one bylaw is general, kind of like the difference between our property standards bylaw and this heritage exercise. It's exactly like that. The one is looking for general maintenance, and the other is specifically identifying anything that is significant. And it could come back that there is no significant trees, or it could come back that we have some trees on the temple property that need specific identification and protection, and that sort of thing. So it's about knowing where these things are. And as Councillor Roy DeClemente says, it's if the work has already been put into it and we have a mapping, then that's great. Let's bring it forward to this council, since it's been over a decade since that was done.
Go ahead, please.
Through you, Madam Mayor. So just for clarification, we already have protections for trees according to our bylaws. But the scope of work that you are giving potentially to staff is to look at every single tree in East Gwillimbury to determine age, whether it meets a 100-year threshold?
No, this is similar to the process we're going through with the heritage list. It's very, very similar, but rather than for houses, it's for all the other culture in East Gwillimbury, whether it be Indigenous sites, whether it be the tree rows on Catering Road, whether it be the Anchor and Anchor Park. We're asking for staff to come back and let us know what other heritage value is there in East Gwillimbury that is not captured under this built form that we're looking at now, which is houses. There's much more to East Gwillimbury than houses. We're not asking them to go and age every tree. We're just asking, going back to, as Councillor Roy DeClemente says, if there's an existing mapping, pulling that out, updating that, and letting us know where to go from here. Certainly it's not about putting a burden on staff. It's about knowing that East Gwillimbury's heritage is more than just homes.
Madam Mayor, I'll just share the draft wording on the screen here.
Thank you. Moved by Councillor Crothers, seconded by,
We would still need a seconder, Madam Mayor.
Be it resolved that staff develop a report to identify and protect all other areas of heritage in East Gwillimbury, including but not limited to significant pre-colonial, my print is very small. Significant pre-colonial sites, significant trees and hedgerows, anchor in Anchor Park, trees on Catering Road, and that staff report back in Q2 2025. I do need a seconder, so Roy Clemente, would you be a seconder? Go ahead, please.
I'm just wondering, through Councillor Carruthers, should we have some wording in there that says that these are examples? Because we have no idea that more may turn up. I just don't want it to look specifically like those particular ones.
Including but not limited to.
Okay. Are we settled with that? Very good. All those in favor? And that's carried. Thank you. Go ahead, please.
Madam Mayor, there was also a request for some information to assist you in terms of potential financial incentives, implications, impacts, that sort of thing. And that's something that in discussions with Mr. Marshall, we do believe he could probably bring back, depending on the scope, as early as the first meeting in June of 2024. And so we would have that prior to you having your further discussions the next time Ms. Bégin brings back this item for consideration. So that's something you might want to put into a resolution as well.
Councillor Foster?
That's exactly what I was trying to support.
There we go.
So, yeah, we'll take some of your wording there, Mr. Velchik.
Madam Mayor, I started a draft there, but with council's assistance, we could get the final wording.
Be it resolved that council requests staff report back with a report regarding tax incentive structure and input from committee.
Councillor Foster, was that Heritage Committee, or you had mentioned a committee?
From the Heritage Committee? Was it from the Heritage Committee?
Yeah, that would be fine, sure. And again, it may not only be a tax incentive structure, there may be other things that come up there, so I'm not sure how we want to word that.
Councillor Roy DeClemente?
So to wordsmith massage, what is it, chief operating wordsmith or something like that? Anyway, so so in my role as COW, be it resolved that council requests staff report back with a report, so you're already duplicating it, so that council requests staff report back regarding the impact of a potential tax incentive structure, and further provide input from the Heritage Advisory Committee and staff regarding the properties identified for potential designation through prior heritage work. And I'm sure, it looks like Ms. Bégin has some input as well.
Thank you, through you, Madam Mayor. I think perhaps it might be helpful just to have sort of an understanding of the impacts of the, the potential financial impacts to the municipality if we were to adopt an incentive structure that's available to us under the Ontario Heritage Act. So we can do that. And then the other piece, I think, is actually encompassed in the work of this project in terms of further engagement and recommendations, and I think we'll form sort of the substantive recommendations of the final report. Okay.
Fine with that? A seconder, Councillor Roy DeClemente. Be it resolved that council requests staff report back regarding the impact of a potential tax incentive structure and further provide input from the Heritage Advisory Committee and staff regarding the properties for potential designation through prior heritage work.
Madam Mayor, can I just suggest, just respectfully suggest to council that if you're going to leave that up, maybe you just break that into 2 resolutions. So the first resolution would be from finance, and it would be the impact of the potential tax incentive structure or program, whatever you want to call it, because we may not have a structure yet, but there could be a program of sorts. So whatever wording you like, we'll understand. And then there could be a separate resolution that kind of speaks to the additional matter that I think you're interested in, which is the 23 properties. I think that's what it's referring to. So that's kind of a separate exercise, which we would undertake concurrently, but somewhat independently of Mr. Marshall's report back to you. That's just a suggestion for your thoughts.
Thank you. Councillor, go ahead, please.
And through you, Madam Mayor, and so should that be tweaked to specify the 23, so that there's no misunderstanding which potential designation properties that we're referring to, that the 23 be put in there? Thank you.
Any other changes, additions? Be it resolved that council requests staff report back regarding the impact on a potential tax incentive structure, and further that staff provide input from the Heritage Advisory Committee and staff regarding the 23 properties identified for potential designation through prior heritage work. All those in favor? And that's carried. So I need a mover and a seconder. Councillor Crone, Councillor Crothers. Be it resolved that the Development Services presentation dated May 14th, 2024, entitled Heritage Strategy Workshop be received. All those in favor? And that's carried. We are now at item F, and that would be a confirming bylaw. Could I have a mover and a seconder, please? Councillor Roy DeClemente, Councillor Crone. Be it resolved that bylaws 2024-039, being a bylaw to confirm the proceedings of special meeting of council held on May 14th, 2024, be taken as read and acted and signed by the mayor and municipal clerk. All those in favor? And that is carried. And we have an adjournment moved by Councillor Foster. Be it resolved that the special meeting of municipal council adjourn at 11:27 a.m. All those in favor? And that's carried. Thank you very much. Thank you, staff. Very much appreciated. Takes us back to our roots, talks about many items that we hear out in the community. So thank you very much for all the work that was put into it. Thank you.